All right. I'm gonna start while you're pulling it up. All right. I was the immediate former Comptroller General of the United States, which in English is Auditor General and Chief Accountability Officer of the United States and CEO of the Government Accountability Office. And I want to talk to you this morning about the number one economic security, national security, international relations, and domestic tranquility issue that the Congress is not addressing, and to date, neither major presidential candidate is addressing. And that is the deteriorating financial condition of the United States, what we need to do to put it back in order, and the fact that we have been abusing our status as the leading reserve currency in the world, and that is now at risk given what's going on internationally, especially with the pending BRICS conference in Russia in October 23rd and 24th. But if you can, Marty, put up the first slide. By the way, if you want a lot more information about this, go to the website americain2040.com. That's americain2040.com. That's my latest book, which talks about the past, the present, the future, and specific solutions to try to be able to put our finances in order that were supported by 77 to 97% of American voters. Next, please.
And David, can you just give a little bit more an intro of yourself, who you are,
Sure,
who you worked for, what
I'm a
government
CPA.
you worked for, et cetera?
Yeah, I'm a CPA by training. I was a global partner with Arthur Andersen before they had their problems, ran a worldwide line of business for them. I've run 3 federal agencies, 2 in the executive branch that deal with pensions and healthcare. I've been a trustee of Social Security and Medicare. I've been chairman of the Audit Committee of the United Nations. I've been Comptroller General of the United States. I've run 2 not-for-profits focused on government transformation and fiscal responsibility, sustainability. I've taught at the Naval Academy. I'm on the Defense Business Board. Those are just a few examples of what I've done.
And you were Comptroller under Clinton, Bush?
Clinton and Bush. And I've had positions in every administration but one since 1980. Some of which full-time, some of which part-time, some of which paid, some of which were pro bono, like the Defense Business Board. And for the record, even though I've given over 20 years of my life to the federal government, I don't get a dime in government pensions or retiree health care. Not a dime. I'm leading by example with regard to fiscal responsibility. So let's go to the first slide if we can.
Okay, 1 second.
The federal government has grown dramatically since 1913. In 1912, the federal government was about 2.5% of the economy. That's the way you measure the size of the government, not number of employees. It's how much does it spend as a percentage of the total economic pie. Next slide, please. In 2023, it was 22.4% of GDP and rising. So stated differently, it's almost 10 times bigger as a percentage of the economy than it was in 1912. 3 things happened in 1913 that fueled the size and growth of federal government. The income tax, the Federal Reserve was established, and the direct election of senators. Those 3 things fueled the growth of the federal government and the undercutting of states' rights. Next, please. In 1912, the Congress controlled 97% of all federal spending. There was no mandatory spending but one thing, and that was called interest. And back then, it was before the Federal Reserve, so we couldn't manipulate interest rates. We had to pay market rates. So 97% was controlled, and 97% got us something. Now, if you fast forward to 2023, 73% of federal spending in that year was mandatory spending. We've written a blank check. It's on autopilot. Discretionary spending, 27%, and shrinking, which includes every express and enumerated responsibility envisioned by the founders in the Constitution. Read the preamble of the Constitution and compare that to what the federal government is doing now and spending money on. Next, please. You know, the government's got a lot of different ways to measure things. It tends to want to understate the problems and overstate the progress. I guess that's human nature, but the government does it on steroids. I'm just going to talk about a couple of these numbers. In 1979, both the debt held by the public and the debt subject to the debt includes debt held by various trust funds like Social Security and Medicare, was under $1 trillion. And in 2023, it was the debt subject to the debt ceiling was over $33 trillion. If you look at total liabilities and unfunded promises, which includes things like unfunded civilian and military pensions, retiree health care, unfunded Social Security, Medicare obligations, it's gone from less than $1 trillion in 79 to 123 trillion at the end of 2023 and growing rapidly. And that's multiple times the size of our economy and growing much faster than our economy. Next, please. Social Security and Medicare are in trouble. Social Security's trust fund is set to go to zero in 2033. If nothing is done about it, there will be 21% across the board cuts immediately. That's what the law requires. Medicare's got a little bit more time, but there would be 11% across the board cuts for that program if nothing changes. Marty, we need to go to the next slide. Oh, by the way,
1 second.
and any presidential candidate that says, I'm not going to touch Social Security, by definition means they're for 21% across the board cuts in 9 years, because that's what you get if you don't touch Social Security. We need to reform it to make it solvent, sustainable, secure. There are ways to do that. They're all outlined in the book. So what's the bottom line? The federal government's grown dramatically. It's promised too much. It's subsidized too many. It's lost control of its budget. It's got to restructure its finances if it wants to create a better future. Our current fiscal and monetary policies are unsustainable. Failure to act will have severe adverse consequences for America and most Americans. The leading indicator on the way up as a superpower and the way down is economic power. And if you can't put your finances in order, you will not maintain economic power. And no country is exempt from the laws of prudent finance, including the United States. Next, please. I focus on three things when I look at metrics. I focus on debt as a percentage of the GDP because not all debt is bad. You know, sometimes you have to take on debt in order to be able to win wars. Sometimes you have to take on debt to try to be able to fight recessions or national emergencies. Sometimes you take on debt in order to invest in the future in a way that generates a positive rate of return. But when you end up borrowing money just to be able to pay your current bills, and you do it with increasing frequency and increasing magnitude, that's fundamentally imprudent and unsustainable. So this first graphic is debt to GDP from the beginning of the Republic projected out to 2054. And you can see that up until World War II, we were very responsible. I mean, we took our fiscal responsibility seriously. We didn't just live for today. We tried to help make sure that we were leaving things better off and better positioned for the future. That is part of what posterity is about in the Constitution. It's for ourselves and our posterity. World War II, we bet the ranch, but after World War II, we ended up, growing the economy much faster than the debt. We didn't pay down the debt. We just grew the denominator in debt to GDP faster than the numerator. But we lost control in recent years. And now, rather than growing the denominator faster than the numerator in debt to GDP, we're doing the opposite with increasing frequency, and demographics are working against us, healthcare costs. And what's the fastest growing expense in the federal budget? Interest. And what do you get for interest? As we say in the South, shinola, nothing. All right. So this is the first metric, debt to GDP. The second metric is mandatory spending as a percentage of the budget. It's 73% growing now. The third metric is interest as a percentage of the budget. You're going to see that in a minute. Next, please. Well, let's look at debt to GDP for recent presidents. Gross numbers can be misleading. And as I said, debt to GDP is probably the most important number. We're too high now and headed a lot higher. But shockingly, when you look at recent presidents, the president who has the worst record on debt to GDP is Barack Obama. But let me also state that the last president that we had that was fiscally responsible was Bill Clinton. No president has been fiscally responsible since Bill Clinton. When I became Comptroller General in 1998, for 4 years, we had surpluses. For 2 of those years, we paid down debt. In 2003, 3 things happened that convinced me that Washington was out of touch and out of control. We had a second round of tax cuts that were supposed to pay for themselves. They didn't come close to paying for themselves. We invaded a sovereign nation on false pretenses for the purpose of taking out the government without declaring war. Some are asserted that it would pay for itself. It cost thousands of lives and trillions of dollars, created a vacuum in the Middle East, eliminated a check and balance against Iran, and now we have a very unstable Middle East at the present point in time. And thirdly, we expanded Medicare to add prescription drugs. It added $8 trillion in new unfunded obligations when Medicare was already underfunded $19 trillion. Those three things happened in 1 year. And that's when I started speaking out with increasing frequency and volume, including being on 60 Minutes several times with regard to this issue. Next, please. Well, let's look at the macro here. If you look at the macro of spending as a percentage of GDP, and that's what really matters, don't talk about gross numbers. I mean, inflation will send revenues up. Bracket creep will send revenues up. You have to look at revenues as a percentage of GDP. You have to look at spending as a percentage of GDP. That's the way you take a look at it. We're spending higher than the post-World War II average. We're taxing, right now about the same or a little bit less. The gap is great, about $2 trillion a year, and you can convert that to percentage of GDP, and the gap is increasing. And so clearly our current path is unacceptable. You have people that say, well, gee, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And I'm going to pay for it. Hey, we're in the hole $2 trillion a year. You can't add new stuff and just pay for it. Okay. That dog don't hunt. Next slide. Now let's look at, what's growing. Okay. And if you look at this on the spending side, you'll see that, Social Security is a challenge, but it's a manageable challenge. If you look at healthcare, it's a major challenge. But what's the fastest growing expense in the federal government? Interest. We're already spending more on interest than national defense. We're already spending more on interest than Medicare. And on the current path, it's going to end up being the #1 spending program within the next 30 years. That's obvious.
David, can I ask you what interest rates you're assuming in that interest projection?
Yeah, this is based upon the CBO's latest forecast. You'd have to take a look to see exactly, but I will tell you, they are not assuming that interest rates are going to stay at the current levels. They're assuming that they're going to come down from the current levels and stay down for the current levels. So if anything, I think this is
so it's relatively optimistic. Okay,
that's correct. I believe it's optimistic. Okay, it also assumes that all of the tax cuts are going to expire. It also assumes that we're not going to have any more emergencies or foreign conflicts. It also assumes that we're not going to have any new spending programs. And if you listen to the debate tonight, and if you've been reading, all of those are totally unrealistic assumptions. So this is
that's over a 30-year horizon.
Yes, right. Here we go. Next slide. We're taking on water, okay? The USS United States, okay? Now, there's two kinds of spending. There's front door spending, which we're all affiliated with, all know about, defense spending and transportation spending and Social Security and Medicare and education and whatever. And then there's backdoor spending. Backdoor spending comes through the tax code. Deductions, exemptions, credits, exclusions. In 2023, there was about $1.8 trillion in tax preferences. You compare that to the total amount of individual and corporate income tax revenues, how much we spend on Social Security, Medicare, defense, and you can see that, believe it or not, when you add front door spending and tax expenditures, which are mandatory spending, they automatically happen without changing the law. The Congress controls less than 15% of annual spending. Now, how can you have a budget when your budget only controls 15% of mandatory, 15% of overall spending? And by the way, I'm 72 years old, although my doctor says I'm more like 52, but who knows, in my lifetime, the Congress has passed timely budgets and appropriation bills on time by the beginning of the fiscal year 4 times in 72 years. And they're not going to do it this year. And the last time they did it was 1996 for the 1997 budget. Washington is badly broken. Next, please.
David, I understand 72 is the new 52. Anyway, so just a quick question here on this chart. But Social Security is paid into, right? I mean, it's not like
Look,
right?
Social Security is funded primarily by payroll taxes paid by individuals and employers, but it also receives the benefit of any taxation of Social Security benefits. They go into the trust fund as well. It was positive cash flow for a long time. That's how it built up bond reserves. It is now negative cash flow. All the bonds are supposed to be extinguished by 2033. When those bonds are extinguished, based on current law, you can only pay benefits from current revenues in the trust fund, which would mean a 21% across the board cut for everybody, irrespective of income and age. That's obviously not acceptable from a variety of perspectives. It will be reformed, but we just need to do it sooner rather than later.
Yep.
Okay, next, please.
Okay, 1 second.
So where do we get our money? Okay, I mean, who's financing our debt? U.S. individuals and institutions have the biggest. The Federal Reserve is second. We've been self-dealing in our own debt in order to try to hold down interest rates. Almost all of the stimulus spending that was done to combat COVID was financed by the Federal Reserve through the modern monetary theory, which is a flawed and failed theory that needs to be thrown in the trash bin of history. But we also rely upon foreign lenders. And by the way, those foreign lenders are reducing their appetite for U.S. debt. China and Japan in particular are reducing their appetite for U.S. debt because they can read financial statements. Next, please. Now, what's the consequences of doing nothing? Slower economic growth, less individual opportunity, growing economic divide between the haves and have-nots, less national security, lower international standing, less domestic tranquility, higher interest costs, loss of confidence in the dollar, and potential global depression. I would respectfully suggest we don't want that scenario. And there's only two ways that you're going to not get that scenario. The biggest deficit Washington has is a leadership deficit. We don't have enough people who are telling the truth to the American people about where we are, where we're headed, how we compare to others. We have a lot of people making promises, whether it be on the spending side or whether it be on the tax side. The math doesn't come close to working. Next slide. So what do we need to do? We need to do three things, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. We need to stop the bleeding. We're spending way too much. We need to cut spending, to cut the base of spending immediately to eliminate things that were supposed to be one-time items. And we need to go after the tremendous amount, hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud associated with what happened during the pandemic. We need to stabilize the patient. We need to have a statutory fiscal sustainability commission that will engage the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, set the table for a tough vote in Congress. I've done more citizen education engagement than anybody in the country, 47 states, several territories and countries. The people are way ahead of the politicians. They will accept tough choices if they're part of a comprehensive goal-based plan consistent with principles and values that bring people together rather than divide them. It's all in the book, American2040.com. And then thirdly, we got to cure the disease. Washington's become addicted to spending, deficits, and debt. It is focused on today rather than trying to help create a better tomorrow. We are mortgaging the future of our kids, grandkids, and future generations. That's irresponsible.